Hello, everyone. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Prof. Jeffrey Sachs Fan World. And here is today's content. As I examine the unfolding confrontation between the United States and China, I see Beijing deploying a very deliberate mix of commercial and regulatory instruments to respond to U.S. tariffs. These measures are not random reactions. They are carefully calibrated expressions of China's economic power, designed to send a political message while minimizing domestic damage. My task here is to clarify exactly what China is doing, why these actions matter, and what they reveal about the shifting global economic landscape. First, China is retaliating through targeted tariffs and import restrictions. I see Beijing focusing on sectors of the U.S. economy that are politically sensitive: agriculture, energy-related products, and specific categories of manufacturing. These are industries tied to key American constituencies, particularly those whose political support is vital in national elections. When Beijing selectively limits purchases of American soybeans or imposes new obstacles for U.S. exporters, it is doing more than adjusting trade flows. It is inserting pressure points directly into the American political system. This is a classic asymmetric strategy hit where the opponent feels it most. Second, China is leaning on its dominance in critical materials and midstream industrial processes. I pay close attention to China's use of export controls on rare earth elements, permanent magnets, and related processing technologies, inputs essential to electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and even defense systems. These are areas where China does not merely participate in global supply chains, it anchors them. When Beijing tightens controls on these inputs, it is not simply inconveniencing U.S. firms, it is shaking the foundation of entire industrial ecosystems. Third, China is employing regulatory tools, licensing requirements, compliance inspections, and administrative slowdowns to create friction for U.S. companies operating inside China. These regulatory maneuvers are subtle and deniable, but their effect can be profound. They heighten uncertainty, deter investment, and complicate long-term planning for American multinationals. In many ways, these tools are more effective than tariffs because they exploit China's institutional flexibility and the opacity of its bureaucratic machinery. Taken together, these actions form a coherent strategy. China is signaling that it will not absorb U.S. pressure passively and that it possesses its own formidable economic leverage. I view this strategy as fundamentally political. By concentrating costs on vulnerable U.S. sectors and by demonstrating control over critical supply chain choke points, Beijing aims to reshape Washington's incentives. It is attempting to shift the negotiation terrain from one in which the U.S. unilaterally imposes tariffs to one in which both sides recognize the mutual capacity to inflict economic harm. Yet I also see limits to China's approach. Retaliation imposes costs on Chinese producers, manufacturers, and consumers. The more Beijing weaponizes trade, the more it risks accelerating global diversification away from China's supply chains. These measures, while powerful, are not free. They are best understood as tactical and temporary rather than decisive. Still, the message is unmistakable. China is prepared to wield its commercial power with precision and resolve. And the United States, if it ignores this reality, risks misreading the strategic balance now emerging in the global economy. As I evaluate China's response to U.S. tariffs, I find it crucial not merely to catalog the tools Beijing deploys, but to understand the strategic logic behind them. China is not improvising. It is navigating a complex geopolitical and economic environment with a blend of confidence, caution, and long-term calculation. When I analyze China's behavior, I see a nation that possesses substantial leverage, yet simultaneously faces profound structural vulnerabilities. Both realities are true, and both must be held in mind if we want a clear view of the global balance of power. Let me begin with the advantages China brings to this contest. At the most basic level, China wields the power of scale. Its enormous domestic market provides leverage, not because China can shut the world out, but because access to its consumers' manufacturing networks and investment flows remains valuable for multinational firms. When Beijing hints that a particular sector may face regulatory tightening, or that a specific foreign company might encounter heightened scrutiny, it exerts influence far beyond the immediate policy action. The mere possibility of constrained access to China can alter corporate behavior around the world. This is not theoretical. I see it weekly in the decisions multinational boards make to avoid provoking Beijing. China's second advantage lies in its role within global supply chains. Over several decades, China has not only become a manufacturing hub, it has also secured dominance in midstream activities such as processing raw minerals, assembling complex components, and producing inputs essential to green technologies, consumer electronics, and industrial machinery. Even when production shifts to Vietnam, India, or Mexico, the intermediate parts and materials that flow into those factories frequently originate in China. That level of integration grants Beijing structural power. It can raise friction, delay shipments, or tighten export rules in ways that ripple through entire industries. Third, I must emphasize China's political coordination capacity. Beijing can mobilize its bureaucracy, state-owned enterprises, financial institutions, and regulatory authorities with an effectiveness unmatched by any Western government. When the Chinese leadership decides to retaliate, it can synchronize actions across multiple agencies and sectors within days. The United States, by contrast, must navigate a fragmented political system, multiple veto points, and an increasingly polarized Congress. China's centralized system gives it speed. America's pluralistic system gives it legitimacy but slows decision-making. Both realities are true, and both must be held in mind if we want a clear view of the global balance of power. Yet, for all these strengths, I am equally attentive to the constraints. China faces constraints so deep and structural that they shape the outer limits of Beijing's coercive capacity. It understands that overusing economic pressure can accelerate the very decoupling it wants to slow. Second, China faces mounting domestic economic challenges, demographic decline, high youth unemployment, property sector instability, and a persistent reliance on state-driven investment rather than productivity-driven growth. These internal weaknesses limit the degree to which Beijing can escalate trade battles without inflicting damage on its own fragile economic foundations. When I speak to Chinese economists, they acknowledge that retaliation is often a double-edged sword. It protects China's political position, but it can also deepen economic strain. Third, China must contend with the international response it triggers. Economic coercion rarely occurs in a vacuum. When Beijing tightens control over critical minerals or imposes restrictions on foreign companies, the United States and its allies often respond with new partnerships, expanded supply chain cooperation, or incentives to build production capacity elsewhere. Over time, China's leverage diminishes as alternative suppliers emerge. I have seen similar dynamics in the history of OPEC, US, and Japan trade tensions and other episodes of concentrated economic power. What then is the equilibrium? When I analyze both sides of the ledger, I conclude that China's advantage in economic statecraft is real but inherently temporary. Beijing can impose short-term pain with impressive precision, but sustaining that leverage is far more difficult. Long-term dominance requires technological leadership, demographic vitality, political stability, and stable external relations, areas where China faces significant headwinds. The deeper logic behind China's strategy becomes clear when we see these strengths and vulnerabilities together. Beijing does not seek total economic warfare. It seeks deterrence. It wants Washington to recognize that tariffs are not costless and that China possesses tools to impose countervailing pressure. China's goal is not to win a trade war, but to raise the price of escalation high enough to force negotiation or restraint. The deeper logic behind China's strategy becomes clear when we see these strengths and vulnerabilities together. Beijing does not seek total economic warfare. It seeks deterrence. It wants Washington to recognize that tariffs are not costless and that China possesses tools to impose countervailing pressure. China's goal is not to win a trade war, but to raise the price of escalation high enough to force negotiation or restraint. And this is where the real geopolitical insight lies. China's commercial retaliation is not a display of unbounded strength, nor is it the sign of a weak nation lashing out. It is the maneuvering of a major power seeking to manage its vulnerabilities while signaling its resolve. China is telling the United States that in the interconnected world of the 21st century, coercion flows in multiple directions and that Washington must adjust its assumptions accordingly. When I look closely at China's recent actions, I do not see them as isolated trade maneuvers. I see signaling strategic, deliberate, and layered. Beijing is communicating messages on multiple levels at once to Washington, to its own domestic audience, to multinational firms, and to the wider global community. To understand these signals, I must dissect how China blends economic tools with political intent. Only then can I properly interpret whether these actions represent a warning, a negotiation tactic, or a long-term strategic doctrine. Let me begin with the clearest layer, the tactical warning to Washington. When China imposes targeted tariffs or tightens export controls, it is not simply reacting to U.S. measures tit for tat. It is engaging in what I would call cost-shaping behavior. China is telling the United States, if you escalate tariffs or pressure campaigns, we have tools that can inflict real and immediate consequences. This type of signaling is common in great power politics. Nations seek to modify the opponent's expectations by demonstrating credible capabilities. The Chinese message, therefore, is not just economic, it is psychological. Beijing wants U.S. policymakers to understand the risks before they take additional steps. But this is only one layer. Another layer of signaling is aimed at global industries and multinational corporations. When Beijing restricts access to certain raw materials or complicates operations for specific American companies inside China, it is also shaping the strategic calculations of global firms. The message is subtle but powerful. Your future depends on stable relations with us. If Washington moves toward confrontation, your operations may be at risk. By doing this, China tries to create a feedback loop where global businesses in turn pressure Washington to de-escalate. I find this tactic sophisticated because it leverages global interdependence in Beijing's favor. A third layer of signaling is domestic. China must demonstrate to its citizens and to its political elites that it will not be bullied by foreign powers. Economic coercion from the United States, if left unanswered, could undermine public confidence in the Chinese leadership. When Beijing retaliates strongly, it reinforces nationalist legitimacy and assures its population that China is acting as a sovereign power capable of protecting its interests. In this sense, China's actions are not only external deterrence, but also internal reassurance. Now, let me address the deeper question. Is this a long-term strategic warning from China about the future trajectory of U.S.-China relations? I believe so. I see Beijing using these measures to articulate a broader doctrine, one that extends beyond immediate tariff disputes. China is signaling that it has entered a new phase of its national strategy where it will no longer respond to pressure with restraint or accommodation. Instead, it will respond with counter pressure, often precisely targeted and economically disruptive. In other words, Beijing is redefining the norms of great power economic interaction. For decades, China tolerated asymmetries and imbalances in its relationship with the United States because it prioritized development and stability. That era is ending. China is now asserting that it is a peer power, not a subordinate one. However, I must be careful not to overstate the coherence of this shift. China's signaling is not the same as a declaration of economic war. Beijing still seeks stability. It still wants foreign investment, technology exchange, and trade access. Its message is calibrated, not reckless. China does not want decoupling. It wants recognition of mutual vulnerability. If Washington believes it can impose tariffs, export bans, and geopolitical pressure with no significant response, China aims to correct that perception. This takes us to the most important interpretive layer, strategic restraint. China's actions, though forceful, have been selective. Beijing has not mobilized its full economic power. It has not broadly banned U.S. companies, nor has it severed entire supply chains. Instead, it applies pressure at narrow choke points, rare earths, components, permissions, and politically sensitive imports, while keeping the broader commercial relationship intact. To me, this indicates that China wants dialogue, not collapse. It seeks leverage, not rupture. Therefore, when I ask whether China is issuing a warning, the answer is yes, but the warning is not apocalyptic. It is pragmatic. China is saying, if you escalate, we will respond. If you pressure us, we will raise the cost. But if you negotiate, we are ready. This is a classic great power posture strength without recklessness, resolve, without ideological absolutism. What Beijing wants from Washington is not capitulation, but recognition that China is now a structural pillar of the global economy and cannot be treated as a peripheral actor in American policy. The deeper truth is that China's warning is not ultimately about tariffs. It is about the future architecture of the international order. Beijing is asserting that the United States must share economic space, not monopolize it. And unless Washington understands this new reality, the cycle of escalation will continue, each round more costly than the last. As I assess China's strategy and the broader trajectory of U.S.-China economic tensions, I believe the United States now faces a decisive crossroads. The old approach, reflexive tariffs, reactive politics, and fragmented policymaking, is no longer viable. If America wants to regain a stable leadership position in the global economic system, it must adopt a strategy that is coherent, morally grounded, and internationally coordinated. In this section, I outline what I believe the United States must do, not in slogans or abstractions, but in clear policy terms. First, the United States needs to abandon the illusion that unilateral pressure will bend China to America's will. That strategy might have worked in the early 2000s when China still depended deeply on U.S. technology, capital, and markets. But today, China has matured into a diversified, technologically capable economic power with its own global partnerships. Tariffs and punitive measures, when imposed without a broader diplomatic framework, achieve little beyond raising prices for American consumers and provoking Chinese retaliation. The United States must shift from punishment to negotiation, still firm but rational, rule-based. Second, I believe America must invest heavily in rebuilding its own industrial foundations. Part of the current American anxiety toward China stems from decades of domestic underinvestment. The U.S. allowed critical manufacturing capacities, supply chain resilience, and technological leadership to erode while relying excessively on global outsourcing. China did not steal America's competitiveness. America neglected its own. If Washington wants to regain leverage, it must revive physical infrastructure, strengthen semiconductor capacity, invest in renewable energy industries, and modernize logistics. Tariffs do not create competitiveness, innovation, and investment do. Third, the United States must work with allies rather than act alone. One of America's greatest advantages historically was not its economic size, but the depth of its alliances. When Washington acts in coordination with Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada, and emerging market partners, it shapes the global rules of the game. When it acts alone, it isolates itself. To counterbalance China's economic strengths, the United States should build coalitions around critical minerals, technological standards, industrial policy, and supply chain diversification. Such cooperation allows the U.S. to reduce dependence on China without entering a dangerous spiral of decoupling. Fourth, America must rethink the role of trade policy in its domestic political system. Too often, Washington uses trade tools to satisfy short-term electoral objectives rather than long-term strategic goals. Tariffs become messaging devices rather than economic instruments. This undermines credibility and confuses allies. In this section, I outline what I believe the United States must do, not in slogans or abstractions, but in clear policy terms. Fifth, I believe the United States must re-engage with multilateral institutions instead of bypassing them. The World Trade Organization, global development banks, and regional economic compacts are imperfect, but they remain essential platforms for regulating great power competition. China is increasingly active in these arenas. The United States, by contrast, has become hesitant or disengaged. The United States needs a transparent framework for economic engagement with China. What should be protected for national security, what should be open for legitimate competition, and what should require negotiation. Without such clarity, the U.S. will oscillate between overreaction and underreaction. If Washington wants a rules-based order that constrains coercive behavior, whether Chinese or American, it must help write and update the rules. Walking away only creates a vacuum that China will fill. Sixth, the U.S. must rebuild economic diplomacy, not military posturing, as its primary tool in Asia. The Indo-Pacific region is not asking for confrontation. It is asking for stability, investment, and sustainable growth. Finally, and most importantly, the United States must adopt a moral framework. Economic statecraft should not be driven by zero-sum nationalism. It should be guided by a commitment to shared prosperity, climate stability, and peaceful coexistence. When America's policies align with global welfare, not merely national advantage, its leadership becomes legitimate and durable. If the United States defines China solely as a rival to be contained, it will sabotage opportunities for cooperation on global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and debt relief. These issues require joint leadership, not mutual suspicion. In my view, the United States must recognize a basic truth. China's rise is not inherently a threat. The real threat is the collapse of cooperative global systems that protect all nations from instability. America's task is not to defeat China, but to coexist with it while strengthening its own institutions, deepening its alliances, and working to shape a global order grounded in fairness and mutual respect. This is not a call for softness. It is a call for strategy. And only by adopting such a strategy can the United States regain its position, not as an empire commanding obedience, but as a principled leader commanding respect. As I draw together the threads of this analysis, I find myself returning to a fundamental question. Can China sustain the advantage it currently wields in its economic confrontation with the United States? And beyond that, what kind of global order will emerge from this prolonged rivalry? These questions go beyond tariffs and export controls. They touch the deepest issues of power, legitimacy, and long-term global stability. Let me begin with the first question, China's ability to maintain leverage. In the short run, I believe China absolutely can. Its dominance in key supply chain segments, its capacity for rapid political coordination, its vast domestic market, and its ability to apply focused economic pressure give Beijing a powerful toolkit. As long as China holds choke points in minerals, components, and advanced manufacturing inputs, it can disrupt American industries at critical points of vulnerability. But when I extend the timeline into the medium and long term, I see China's leverage becoming more fragile. Economic coercion tends to invite counter-coercion. Choke points provoke diversification. Over-reliance on any single supplier accelerates the development of alternatives. We have seen this repeatedly throughout history, from the oil crises of the 1,970 seconds to the semiconductor realignments of the 1,990 seconds. Power based on asymmetry rarely endures once the targeted nation mobilizes and adapts. China knows this, and it is one reason why its retaliatory actions remain selective rather than total. A strategy based on permanent coercion would eventually weaken Beijing's own position. So my answer is this, China's advantage is real, but it is not durable unless the United States fails to respond coherently. If Washington rebuilds domestic capacity, aligns with allies, and stabilizes its trade policy, China's leverage will erode naturally. If it does not, Beijing will retain a powerful, though not absolute, upper hand. Now let me turn to the broader question. What kind of world will result from this rivalry? I believe we are entering a multipolar economic order, one in which the United States and China are the two central pillars, but not the only ones. Europe, India, Japan, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and parts of Africa will all shape the emerging global landscape. This is a world defined not by bipolar confrontation, but by complex networks of interdependence. No single nation, not even the United States or China, will be able to dictate outcomes unilaterally. This new order poses challenges. It is harder to coordinate global standards, manage crises, or pursue shared goals when power is distributed, but it also offers opportunities for balance, innovation, and mutual restraint. A multipolar world can be more stable than a unipolar one, provided that great powers learn to navigate differences peacefully. Where does this leave the United States? In my view, America must embrace leadership through cooperation rather than dominance. Its greatest strength has always been its ability to build alliances, foster institutions, and articulate universalistic principles, democracy, human rights, sustainable development, and scientific progress. If the United States leans into these strengths, it remains a global leader. If it retreats into narrow nationalism, it will diminish itself. Where does this leave China? China must recognize that its influence will be shaped not only by power, but by how that power is used. If Beijing seeks cooperative integration, it will rise as a respected global actor. If it seeks to replace American dominance with its own, it will trigger resistance and accelerate fragmentation. China's future influence depends as much on restraint as on strength. And where does this leave the world? I believe humanity faces a profound choice. We can drift into a 21st century version of Cold War logic, decoupling distrust and militarized economics. Or we can forge a new model of coexistence where competition occurs within guardrails and where shared challenges, climate change, pandemics, inequality, and technological governance take precedence over zero. What is my conclusion? Simply this: China's warning to the United States is real. Its leverage is significant. Its strategy is increasingly assertive. But none of this predetermines conflict. The future will be shaped not by the power either nation holds, but by the wisdom with which that power is exercised. If the United States responds with thoughtful strategy rather than reactive hostility, and if China embraces responsible leadership rather than coercive ambition, both nations and the world can avoid the disastrous logic of escalation. The path forward is narrow but possible. It requires humility from great powers, cooperation among allies, and a renewed commitment to global stability. If we take that path, this era of tension may ultimately give rise not to conflict, but to a more balanced and sustainable world order.